Paul McCartney's death in 1966 goes much deeper than an MI5 replacement operation. Years prior to the Millennium Report website going online, one of our writers conducted exhaustive research into the "Paul McCartney is dead" conspiracy. It is, in fact, a real conspiracy because of the number of willing participants who by necessity had to participate in it in order for it to be successful for almost 50 years. However, only one element has been missing over the past 49 years. And that is a member of the Beatles stepping forward to tell the unvarnished truth. It now appears that this little secret has been finally told by Ringo Starr. Certainly, with the death of his bandmates, except Paul, of course, the burden of this secret became greater for him to carry alone as the years wore on. The newsprint piece shown above well captures the respective roles of the four Beatles. What it fails to point out is that Ringo Starr was not only the drummer, he was also the heartbeat of the band, as all drummers are. It now appears that the true story about Paul is Ringo's to tell, or else the heartbeat would become increasingly labored by the sheer weight of the harder-to-hide truth. The internet has a way of doing that, yes? There is no one else who has the authority, by virtue of his first-hand experience with the whole wild and crazy affair, like Ringo Starr. The exhaustive research conducted over several years did produce an extraordinary amount of evidence pointing to the great likelihood that the original Paul McCartney did leave the Beatles circa in 1966. There is now a massive body of forensic proof, anecdotal testimony, scientific photograph assessment, comparative voice analysis, circumstantial evidence, etc. on the internet which supports Ringo Starr's alleged revelations. The following article appears to be correct in stating all the primary facts with the exception of the very last paragraph as follows. The British MI5 also announced an investigation to determine if an impostor could have indeed posed for 48 years as a member of the Order of the British Empire. Sir James Paul McCartney, during official ceremonies involving Queen Elizabeth II. Surely, it was MI5 which coordinated the entire cover-up, since they were best positioned to ensure that the conspiracy of silence would stick for so many years. As for why the Beatles agreed to go along with the cover-up scheme since 1966, the answer, especially if you were living during the 1960s and had sisters who could sing every single Beatles song with perfection, is quite obvious. Paul McCartney's death would have triggered an unprecedented shock to his millions of young and often delirious female fans around the entire world. For a much better explanation of just how traumatic such a shocking revelation would have been in 1966, the following true story is presented for the reader's edification. Quote, during the Beatles' performance at Shea Stadium, which kicked off their 1965 US tour, the massive contingent of New York City policemen who were assigned to crowd control reported rivers of urine which flowed from the girls and young women in attendance. They were in such genuinely altered states. They were so excited and beside themselves that they were literally unconscious to controlling their bodily functions. End quote. Clearly, MI5, MI6, together with the British monarchy and Parliament had to make a very swift command decision to hide the death of Paul McCartney. The following quote from Guitar World's article titled, "Did Paul McCartney Actually Die in 1966?" reveals more of the inside story. The replacement of Paul McCartney, why? And by whom? The article below, as it turns out, was published by a tabloid-styled, for journalism website by the name of World News Daily Report. However, it contains a general narrative regarding the Paul McCartney story which could actually be true, right down to the exact dates and details. That the real Paul McCartney left the world scene on November the 9th of 1966 is an absolute certainty for those initiated into this particular line of inquiry and investigation. Their only questions relate to why MI5, Military Intelligence, Section 5, arranged for his removal. And, exactly who did they replace him with? Their underlying theory goes like this. Paul McCartney's 1966 death was the result of an MI5 black operation overseen by the Tavistock Institute. The Beatles, it was understood, had way too much power and influence for the British intelligence services not to take advantage of it. How to practically harness such power and influence, however, remained a very difficult task, especially given the indomitable John Lennon and deeply spiritual George Harrison. The Security Service, commonly known as MI5, Military Intelligence, Section 5, is the United Kingdom's domestic counterintelligence and security agency, and is part of its intelligence machinery, alongside the Secret Intelligence Service (SIS), also known as MI6, focused on foreign threats, Government Communications Headquarters (GCHQ), and Defense Intelligence (DI). The drug overdose death of their first manager Brian Epstein, in 1967 devastated the Beatles, as it was meant to. His knowledge of Paul's death led to serious personal problems, as well as posed a hugely unpredictable public issue, that George Harrison lost his bouts with throat cancer, lung cancer and a brain tumor at the age of 58, are also considered suspect by many. Then there was John Lennon's shocking assassination at 40 years old, by Manchurian candidate Mark David Chapman, which was the direct result of his ardent anti-war stance and incessant world peace message. The Beatles led the British invasion bands. The key piece of this ongoing and originally British musical phenomenon, known as the British invasion, revolves around the Beatles, and especially the original Macca, Paul McCartney. For it was Paul who was the premier singer for the first and most famous of all the British invasion bands to invade North America. In that very special and unique capacity did Paul exert an inordinate degree of influence over a musical era defined as the Golden Age of rock, sometimes labeled the Golden Age of modern music. Starting in the early 1960s, the Beatles' arrival in New York City on February 7, 1964, marked the beginning of a worldwide musical revolution that would continue until the mid-1980s. Sometimes known as the Rock and Roll Revolution, this global movement respected no boundaries and utilized the universal language of music and English to transform the entire planetary civilization. British rock groups have consistently occupied the top 7 or 8 positions of the top 10 rock and roll bands of all times lists, with the Beatles always at the number 1 spot. What is not very well known is that throughout the development and evolution of the rock and roll revolution, there were always 2 sides operating in the background, trying hard, very hard, to influence the direction and the content and the spirit of the movement. Only by comprehending his role as the megamaker in this often covert, multi-decade, Anglo-American operation will the real backstory of Paul McCartney be properly understood. So will the true conspiracy behind his death and cover-up, as well as his purposeful replacement. One last series of revelations about the 1966 death of Paul McCartney comes in the form of a book by author Dr. Nick Collerstrom, who is featured in the following video titled, "Who is Paul McCartney?" Published in September 2015, The Life and Death of Paul McCartney, 1942 to 1966. A Very English Mystery offers a riveting account of the true history of the Beatles and in particular Paul's untimely death. Did Ringo Starr admit Paul McCartney died in 1966? Replaced with look-alike? The following article appeared on a site that is often used to leak truths into the public domain. While the exact facts surrounding Ringo Starr's involvement may or may not be true, the background Beatles material certainly fits with the most likely historical narrative. Facebook removes original reference to Paul's death on Google, which appeared on Ringo Starr's personal Facebook page. Former Beatle Ringo Starr claims the real Paul McCartney died in 1966 and was replaced by a look-alike by Barbara Johnson. WorldNewsDailyReport.com. The former drummer of the Beatles, Ringo Starr, surprised the world this morning during an interview in his luxurious Californian residence, when he admitted that the 45-year-old rumors about the alleged death of Paul McCartney in 1966 were actually true. In an exclusive interview with The Hollywood Inquirer, Mr. Starr explained that the real Paul McCartney had died in a car crash on November 9, 1966, after an argument during a Beatles recording session. To spare the public from grief, the Beatles replaced him with a man named William Shears Campbell, who was the winner of a McCartney look-alike contest and who happened to have the same kind of jovial personality as Paul. When Paul died, we all panicked, claims Ringo, obviously very emotional. We didn't know what to do, and Brian Epstein, our manager, suggested that we hire Billy Shears as a temporary solution. It was supposed to last only a week or two, but time went by and nobody seemed to notice, so we kept playing along. Billy turned out to be a pretty good musician and he was able to perform almost better than Paul. The only problem was that he couldn't get along with John at all. William Shears Campbell, better known as Billy Shears, does indeed disappear from records in 1966 and no traces of him can be found after Paul's alleged death. Mr. Starr alleges that the group did send out a lot of hidden messages through the years to prepare the population for the truth. He notably says that the entire Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album was awash with Paul is dead clues. The Beatles had indeed officially formed a new band featuring a fictional member named Billy Shears, which happened to be the actual name of Paul's replacement. We felt guilty about the deception, added Ringo Starr. We wanted to tell the world the truth, but we were afraid of the reactions it would provoke. We thought the whole planet was going to hate us for all the lies we had told, so we kept lying but sending subtle clues to relieve our consciousness. When the first rumors finally began about the whole thing, we felt very nervous and started fighting a lot with each other. At some point, it was too much for John and he decided to leave the band. Ringo Starr claims that he finally decided to tell the truth, because he was afraid that it was going to die with him. At age 74, he is the only other surviving member of the famous band besides Paul McCartney, and he was afraid the deception would never be revealed. The rumors of Paul's death began more than 45 years ago, but had always been dismissed as nonsense by the band and its entourage. In September 1969, American college students published a series of articles in which they claimed that clues to McCartney's death could be found among the lyrics and artwork of the Beatles recordings. Clue hunting rapidly proved infectious, and within a few weeks, it had become an international phenomenon. Rumors only declined after a contemporary interview with McCartney was published in Life magazine in November 1969. Neither Paul McCartney nor anyone from his entourage have commented on Ringo Starr's declaration yet, but the interview has already provoked a lot of reactions around the world. Journalists and paparazzis from around the world have surrounded the residence of the musician, only minutes after the interview was broadcasted, and are waiting for the star to comment on the allegations. The British MI5 also announced an investigation to determine if an impostor could have indeed posed for 48 years as a member of the Order of the British Empire. Sir James Paul McCartney, during official ceremonies involving Queen Elizabeth II. It is definitely possible that Paul's replacement was unaware of any furtive plots hatched by MI5 to control the biggest rock band of the era. In that case, where he was installed to cover up a truly accidental death of the real Paul, the following perspective is offered for the reader's consideration. It must be acknowledged that Paul McCartney's replacement was tasked with one of the toughest jobs in the world. Regardless of who he really is, the new Paul, some call him Fall, was certainly coerced, or simply assigned by MI5, to play a role that only preordained destiny could have fatefully brought to him in 1966. In this light, his was perhaps one of the greatest sacrifices made in modern times. For he was compelled to leave behind his real identity for the rest of his life in the interest of the greater good for all of humankind. Yes, he got to play a rock and roll superstar, but that's not nearly as fun or easy as it sounds.